Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Fine. I'm president and founder of the Universe Discovery Project. Today, I'm here with Adam Groh, and we are going to be talking about the free will debate. I'm also here with my co-exec, Karina, who will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karina Kaufman. I'm the research executive this year for the Universe Discovery Project. I'm definitely looking forward to a very interesting conversation about free will versus determinism. First off, Adam, we are so happy to have you here today. Would you be able to introduce yourself and give a little bit of background?
Sure. Well, first thing I'd like to say is thank you, Jacob and Karina, for inviting me to this wonderful UDP initiative. So as you introduced me already, my name is Adam, and I'm a PhD student at the Montreal Neurological Institute of McGill University. And specifically, my area of research focuses mostly on molecular and cellular neuroscience, but I have developed a rather vested interest in this topic over the last few years of my studies. So I'm very excited to delve into the content today with everyone.
Of course, let's get into it. So first off, Adam, what do we mean when we say free will? What does that mean?
I think you got cut off there a little bit. I missed that. You want to say that again? I think I missed that part.
Question, Adam, is what is generally meant by free will?
Sure, so I can conceptualize this in a couple of ways. The first way, put very simply, is that free will can be thought of as the capacity of an individual to choose between kind of different courses of action in a way that's uninfluenced or unimpeded by anything else. And so that's kind of just like a simple definition of free will. A second definition, you can actually kind of purport free will to be kind of involve three separate concepts. So the first would be to have control over your choices. So in the sense that the person who does the action must be the same person who decided to do the action. You then have to have a responsiveness to like some form of reason, I guess you could say, in the sense that it can't be like a random decision that you made. And then the other thing is, I guess those would be the three things. So, control over the choice itself, the responsiveness to reason, and then the ability to do otherwise, to make a different decision. So that's a more kind of fleshed out version of what free will is. But at its core, it's really just the capacity for someone to choose a different course of action in an uninfluenced way.
And what do we mean exactly by determinism, if you look on the other hand?
Sure. So determinism has an incredibly rich philosophical history that we probably don't have the time to get into in its entirety. But again, if I were to distill that history, determinism purports that kind of all events that occur in the universe are kind of completely determined, if you will, by pre-existing causes. So the opposite of determinism would be indeterminism, or the sense that kind of everything is random in a sense.
Yes, I'd like to, if I may interject a little bit, just to ask clarification. So it seems to me that now we have almost three meta concepts. There's the concept of free will. There's the concept of determinism, which again has a very rich philosophical history, and it also has many different connotations and sub concepts that relate to it. But then there's also the notion of chance. So we have determinism, free will, and chance. And yeah, so I think the discussion today will focus on the debate surrounding these concepts and what the science has to say about it. And Adam will be informing that discussion. So to progress, I guess we'll move on to the third question.
Yeah, I'm interested. What do we mean by the self? Or what do we mean when we say we or I or you?
As in like, I made a choice, we made a decision. What does that mean? So
it's a great question. And it's rather a difficult question to answer, but I'll do my best. When we say the self, we kind of mean an individual as the object, I guess, of its own kind of reflective consciousness. So it's almost as if you were to move out of your own body and look at yourself again. So that is the self. So if you consider an individual as the object of its own reflective consciousness, that would be kind of like a good definition of what the self is. So it's where you're kind of outside looking in, if that makes sense.
So just, you're right. So the self is kind of like an agent that gives rise to subsequent events by the virtue of its own actions that emanate from itself, right?
Exactly.
And I guess the distinction between free will and determinism is free will would say this agent is its own sufficient entity that gives rise to subsequent events, whereas determinism would say this entity is in fact just a product of previous causes and conditions and determinants from the universe that led to this moment. And then chance, you can argue in fact is a form of it also negates free will in that it's saying that the individual events that lead up to it are random and are still not part of the individual's own choices, but randomly lead to the outcomes of the individual so-called choice.
Right. You've conceptualized that, I think, perfectly. Chance, randomness, stochasticity, whatever you'd like to call it, and determinism kind of sit on one side of the argument, whereas I think free will opposes those two.
Right. So yeah, so determinism and chance are in one school, although they in fact do contradict in some ways, depending on what level of analysis one chooses. But those two concepts run in antagonism to the concept of free will. And that is what we'll elaborate on. So without further ado, I guess we can start off by asking what's so controversial, what is problematic with the notion of free will as we've defined it?
Right. So I think what's primarily problematic about free will is the way in which we understand meaning and purpose as human beings when we decide whether or not it exists or whether or not it doesn't exist. So in a sense, free will is our modus operandum, or at least it has been for much of human history. We operate as if free will exists, even though it may not, or it may. And so I think what becomes controversial about free will, at least in popular culture, is, if it doesn't exist, what does that mean? What are the implications for how we interact with one another?
Right.
What are the implications for, how we define our careers and that sort of question? And
that is what's socially controversial about it. But I would also ask, what is scientifically problematic with the notion? What does neuroscience have to say about free will? And what does, I would add, I think other disciplines can also add to the challenges to free will, given the interdisciplinary nature of science, but neuroscience being one area of that. So how would you choose to elaborate?
Sure. So we can go through this carefully. I think there's a rich history in neuroscience, and I'll try to stick to neuroscience given it's my area of expertise. So before I get into the details about what neuroscience has to say about free will and why perhaps it's still controversial from a scientific perspective, I will give an overarching explanation of the history of study of free will in neuroscience. So there's arguments to be had about it starting earlier than the 1980s, but most people would conclude that more formal experimental studies about what free will is and whether or not it exists began in the 1980s. And for decades, neuroscience seemed to appear to state that free will did not exist based on its experimental conclusions. But in the last 2 decades, there have been interesting studies that definitely do not state that free will exists, but they lead us to believe that the original framework within which we thought we were able to say conclusively that free will didn't exist needed an update. So let me flesh that out. So as I'm sure some of your audience members may be familiar with, the most famous experiment related to free will currently is probably the Libet experiment. And the Libet experiment was essentially an investigation by a man and his lab named Benjamin Libet at UCSF in the 1980s to look at the role of consciousness, or of free will, because consciousness is a precursor for free will, in the initiation of motor movements. So what they got participants to do, they had many participants, and I'm greatly simplifying this. The participant would sit down in a room and they would be asked to flex their wrist. And when they flexed their wrist, they were also asked to look at the clock on the wall and denote the exact time that they decided to flex their wrist. And what the results show, and importantly, simultaneously, their neural activity was being recorded in multiple ways. So they're flexing their wrist, they're consciously denoting when they flex their wrist, and all of their brain activity is being measured. And we can get into the details about how it was measured if you'd like. But what the results show at a very simplistic level is that across all of these different ways that the brain activity was being measured, there was actually an increase in brain activity before these individuals reported that they decided to move or to flex their wrist. And this led to the invention of a term called the readiness potential. And the readiness potential is just a name for that activity in the brain that was occurring before the movement was executed, or before the individual decided or was consciously aware of executing that movement. Does that make sense?
Yes, if I may, a follow-up question to that. It seems that these results were viewed as shocking to many, but from a neuroanatomical perspective, is it not the case that many would argue that that is widely accepted that the brain initiates behaviors prior to the behaviors, that before something occurs, there are antecedent causes for that. So before I'm saying my next words, part of the sentence, there are events in the brain that are occurring and are part of this deterministic domino cascade that lead to what I'm saying now. So is that, given this assumption, should it should almost not be that controversial to observe that when people decide something, there are events that lead up to this. There are neuroanatomical events that occur prior to behaviors.
I agree. I think that the way in which the problem is stated and the way in which the experiments were executed, I agree it shouldn't be as controversial as it sounds, especially given other interesting relationships that we know are true, right? About the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We know indeed that there is a delay between, when we decide to initiate a motor act, simply based on the fact that the electrical signal has to travel a distance from our brain to the end of our hand.
Right. Other common sense things like that. Right.
So there's kind of rationalist perspectives that you can take and apply, and it shouldn't be as controversial as it was. I agree with this. But kind of the conclusion, the interpretation of this data initially was kind of bimodal or dichotomous, in a sense that some people said, okay, well, this is self-evident. We already knew this. Now we have experimental proof. The brain therefore unconsciously commits to actions, right? And this suggests that we don't have free will. But the other side of the argument was that, well, this readiness potential, or this ramp up activity, could be completely arbitrary, or it could be kind of non-specific activity that allows the brain to prepare for actually intentioned movement in that sense. So that's kind of what laid the groundwork for more modern, or not necessarily more modern, but more iterative contributions to the study of free will in a neuroscientific context.
Right.
So if we want, we can kind of jump into the kind of other side of the coin, if you'd like, in terms of some other studies that look at free will in the context of a neuroscience framework. So after Libet, which again is this very clear and solid data. And I didn't mention this before, but not only was this readiness potential shown, but it was elaborated upon with multiple measures. So they were able to show that, they hooked up electrodes to these participants' brains, hundreds of electrodes, and they were able to show, using a technique called EEG, or electroencephalography, entire brain activation that was occurring prior to when the participants said that they intentionally moved their wrist.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't just looking at whole brain activation, they also looked at molecular markers. So they showed that neurotransmitters were increasing in activity before the movement. They also showed that single neurons were changing their activity. So they really scaled this across multiple levels of analysis, which shows why this data is so trustworthy. But if we were to transition now into a context that kind of unveils the simplicity of this model, the next iteration of neuroscience studies into looking at free will, we're looking at seeing if they could influence the individual's reported time, or the time at which they report to have intentionally moved, by stimulating their brains after the movement. So what these authors basically showed is that when they applied a stimulation to the brain after a movement, the participant's judgment moved back in time. So this indicates that in this context, the participant's perception of the time of when they moved was actually influenced by activity in the brain after the movement. So it's kind of this idea that we have this post hoc analysis that's being applied to what we think are free movements. So that was one iteration. But the most modern theory, and I think this is where we'll really be able to have a discussion about determinism and so forth, and bring it back to that point, is, I think this was a study in 2012, and I can link to these studies that I'm referencing if anyone would like to follow up with after our conversation. But what these authors essentially found is that internally, or maybe even stochastically or random, if we want to go there, generated neural activity can bias decisions that are expected to be stimulus responsive or reason responsive.
Right. So basically randomness plays a role in decision making.
Exactly.
As measured by stochasticity. Yeah.
Exactly. So some of these factors, they seem to be random due to the noise produced by regular brain activity or default activity, whereas other factors can actually be traced back to decisions that participant had made in the past. So the idea here is that there isn't, as Libet originally described, this kind of, I don't know what the right word is to use, but perhaps there is no mysterious start of an action, that's executed. It's more that an individual's action is an outcome of many elements.
Right. And building on that, why should that be surprising? I mean, in science, we almost have this universal assumption that variables can be explained by their components, that if you could break a variable down into its components and you explain each of the components, you could explain the variable. That assumption is applied in all disciplines, basically. So given that fact, should it be surprising that behavior, which itself is a variable, can be explained by the events and components that lead up to it in a kind of deterministic soup that give rise to behavior? It gives rise to behavior.
Yeah, I'm with you on that point fully. I don't think it should be surprising, but I do think that, it's what I would like to say is it's very interesting how the same concept of deterministic logic can be applied at the neuroscientific level, when we're correlating, individual neural activity to, conscious decisions. And it can also be applied in the same way you've described it to more large scale processes or causes influencing behavior. So on multiple levels of analysis, this deterministic framework, I think, kind of follows suit and fits,
Right.
which I think is testament to its strength in describing.
Right. So determinism in this meta concept sense does apply to neuroscience, but it applies to other disciplines, right? If you're looking at a cell's actions, you break it down into all the molecular events that led up to a given event in the cell. And if the brain is the processing in the brain and behavior and cognition that arise from it are the results of a cascade of cellular, molecular events, where is there room for a variable in addition to the system that some would call free will? Where does that come from? And it seems that with this molecular understanding, with this neurological understanding, it almost contradicts that notion. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, indeed. I think that's true to some extent. And I can push back slightly on that point. But the first thing I would say is that, well, we'll start with the pushback. So I agree very much that this deterministic framework, which in and of itself is a metaphysical claim, all the empirical neuroscientific evidence is in support of that metaphysical claim. So it begs the question, is it then a metaphysical claim anymore? But I agree, like what room is left for this like small margin of error, the free will?
Right.
And the only place I would push back there is simply to say that, neuroscience does have evidence, especially in the literature, looking at the influence of, signaling in our gut, or the influence of emotional regulation, and
extend that list ad infinitum, keep adding the
ad infinitum, right?
And
those things do cycle back to influence the same circuits that theoretically, through a deterministic cause-based framework lead to our consciousness and to our free will. So there is the possibility that future research will be able to look at that small margin of error. But for the most part, the deterministic framework seems to be the most logical explanation for free will.
Right. And would you observe that most neuroscientists are of that view, that there is this deterministic framework that has to be adhered to understand behavior, cognition, and other actions?
Yeah, of course, I can't speak for all of neuroscience, but I would say that the majority of neuroscientists would fit into that almost, you could say, materialist or deterministic kind of framework, where they understand free will as being, the inevitability of an almost infinite number of causes that are related to the functioning of neurons below the level of our perception. If that comes across clearly.
Karina, did you want to add anything to that? Go for it.
No, I was going to ask you actually. So I know you have this idea of, multivariable determination, and, the fact that, different variables come together to explain certain phenomena. And so our actions shouldn't be an exception to this. So if you want to just expand on what you were saying earlier about that.
I think, is this a question for Jacob or for me?
Yeah, this is for Jacob.
Sorry, I thought you were asking Adam, my bad.
Just wanted to clarify an earlier point that you made, if just like briefly.
Sorry, would you mind re-explaining that part a little bit? Just so.
Yeah, for sure. Just your idea of the multi kind of variable approach, right? So any variable can be explained by like other variables. And so is that the strongest argument, would you say, and maybe Adam too, if you could pitch in, for the absence of free will in us?
I would argue that it's hard to say if it's the strongest, but I think it's a very non-controversial assumption that most scientists hold, that variables can be broken down and explained by other variables. And behavior is a variable. Therefore, behavior can be explained by being broken down into its components. And if you knew enough about each one, presumably you could predict what would happen. And this does not need a whole complex, millions of causes, you could even understand and predict possibly certain behaviors just by knowing like a few variables. You could predict what ice cream flavor someone will buy if you knew what their favorite flavor was, and if you knew what was the last flavor they got, and maybe they want to try something new. If you knew about all those variables, you could predict presumably what the outcome would be, and that leaves no room for this ghost in the machine that is, in addition to the system, picking things, that is making choices that lead to action. So that kind of contradicts that notion, I think. Yeah, and I would also add that there are general associations observed about the way behavior is orchestrated, that, for example, there's a link between poverty and crime. So that's one factor. And if you add that to all the other long list of other factors, you could predict what would happen in theory and sometimes in practice. So, yeah.
And Adam, I'm going to circle it back to you because you're very involved in neuroscience, of course. Now, what do you think about determinism specifically for cognition and behavior? For example, the fact that we're actually not aware of 95% of our brain activity. So what do you think about that approach to determinism? And do you have any other comments?
I definitely do. One thing I'll follow up on there, really am going to spend some time answering that question, but one thing that Jacob just mentioned, I think, is a nice tie back in to the beginning of our conversation about how we described determinism and randomness as sitting on the same side, but that they also kind of conflicted, So, we can explain, I like this idea of a multivariable theory, but it flies in the face of the concept of randomness or stochasticity being an explanation for the emergence of free will. Because if we can explain everything in terms of its component parts, it follows naturally then that there is no such thing as randomness. Because if we were simply to know everything about every particle that interacted with each other, there could be no stochasticity, right? And perhaps we're simply not at a point in time in our history that we have the empirical methods to make such deductions. But it could be the case, and I would be willing to sit with you in that camp, Jacob, that that's where we will be eventually. And I think that that's not just consistent across neuroscientists. I think, it would be safe to say that most physicists would agree with that assertion as well. But to jump back, sorry, Karina, into the question about brain activity, I think it's a really interesting jumping off point here. So it is the case that, going back to the concept of the self, that the observer, the individual, isn't aware of the majority of the processing or the brain activity that's going on. Doesn't mean it's not going on, but the level of awareness isn't there. And the reason why that is because for us to be aware of something occurring in our body, that processing has to reach a portion of the brain called the cerebral cortex. And the vast majority of sensory information that's processed by the brain is filtered by structures deeper within the brain called the subcortical structures, and it never reaches that outer layer of the brain. And it's literally right on the outside. It's almost like a metaphor for the way in which it's processing the information.
So,
and that's, you can jump in there for sure.
I just want to jump in and say, so would you then compare that to like, what we're doing is like we're watching a TV screen of all the events that happen in our subconscious mind, that we're just kind of being kind of pulled by the strings of our subconscious. And what consciousness is in some part is it's like a television screen that we're observing of events that happen in parts of the brain that we're not aware of, that their effects we're not aware of. Yeah.
Yes. And this is, it's amazing how even in 2022, the same arguments that were had between rationalists and empiricists are being had as more evidence from neuroscience brings itself forward. And what I mean by that is, we only have at our disposal what emerges into our consciousness. So it could be the case that, there's a lot of really interesting information that is being processed in these lower level structures that I alluded to. You may have heard of the thalamus. The thalamus is like the gateway. So all of the touch information, auditory information, a lot of sensory information is filtered through this structure in the center of our brain. It may be the case that there is really interesting information to be gleaned if we were to consciously interpret it. But this comes back to the idea of evolution. I don't think we will ever be able to consciously interpret that information because, you know, our brains have selected for a structure that makes that impossible, right? If we were to think about all of that processing, we would be overloaded at all times with, you know, touch information, visual information, information from our digestive systems.
And these
evolved
structures
to block that out.
Right, and these structures were established millions of years ago in evolution, and the way that things have evolved just due to that process is such that they are, some of them are at the base of it, and the way scaffolding has occurred has made it so that we cannot access that. It's just part of the structure that exists. So in some sense, like, thoughts are secreted from parts of the brain, much like how the pancreas secretes enzymes that help with digestion. And we're not authoring that. That is just sort of happening. And that, would you agree with that analogy?
Yeah, that's great. I like this, the secretion of thoughts. I think it's a wonderful way to analogize. I think if I were to be slightly more specific about the way in which thoughts arise, it would be more of an emergence. But yeah, secretion, that's a really great way to describe it, right? It is simply the case that the massive body of information and processing and, you know, kind of infinite numbers of feedback loops that lead to thoughts are not at our conscious appreciation. That is a fact, right? So how could it be that we couldn't apply a deterministic framework, right? How could it be that these causes aren't iteratively related to the emergence of our ability to think? So, and I have to do my due diligence as a neuroscientist to say that, of course, in the 21st century, not all of neuroscience can be explained by this simple structure-function relationship. You know, we're able to characterize the brain in the sense that certain regions are, on average, more responsible for certain functions. Like we have the motor cortex that is responsible for movement. We have the somatosensory cortex that's responsible for processing and integrating sensory information. And, you know, if we disrupt these areas generally, it is a testament to the fact that they are responsible for specific functions, because we lose those functions when we disrupt those areas. But there is a lot more higher order processing, right? So as we said earlier, we're not aware of 95% of brain activity. Yes, these brain areas have specific functions, but they're also constantly communicating with each other. And if we disrupt that communication between each other, we also disrupt specific functions. So it isn't as simple as just saying, you know, one part of the brain does one thing. And memory, I don't want to get too much off topic here, but memory and pain processing is actually a really interesting way to analyze that. So memories can be stored in all areas of the brain, and pain can be processed in all areas of the brain. So there are these kind of convergent functions that exist and are scaffolded across a multiplicity of regions, which is very interesting. But none of that, to bring it back to free will, right? None of that really kind of flies in the face of what we're saying here, that there is this iterative, inordinately complex set of interactions between these different brain regions, all of which are below the level of consciousness, some of which are appreciable to our conscious mind, that provide the framework within which we can think and act. And we're not aware of those things. So it follows then that these causes, I guess, from my perspective, these kind of deterministic causes are the most suitable explanation for the emergence of consciousness and thus free will, right? So we don't have any control over much of this sensory processing. It's below the level of our consciousness. So how could we say then that we have control over what we'd like to think about? Because all of the precursors to our thoughts are predetermined.
So that's kind of an
Yeah,
oh.
go for it. Go, no, go for it. Go ahead. Yeah.
All right, all right. So that it was really nice actually to hear from you a perspective from like the neuroscientist perspective, really thinking about what's going on inside the brain and how those cause and effects really, you know, dictate a lot of what humans do. For example, like if someone has a tumor in a certain part of the brain, it can make them either more aggressive. So there are such rare cases that we can study to really understand that not all of our actions necessarily are, you know, in control. Now,
Right.
I also wanted to flip to the other side of that and ask about the environment. So how do environmental factors contribute to the fact that we may not be in control for many of our life circumstances? So how could those external factors affect this discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a very complicated question. But if I were to just kind of start the conversation there, you know, we have this system that I've just described that's constantly processing information, and by system I mean the brain. But not only is that brain being constantly influenced by our environment, and so too there is the way that we think, which then feeds back and changes the way the brain processes. But our brains themselves are the result of, you know, millions of years of evolution, and also they're the result of specific changes in genetics that are specific to our lineage and our family, that are outside of our control. So there's this whole concept of epigenetic influence, right?
Yeah.
There's foundational studies in rats that show that rat pups that aren't licked by their mothers have a much higher likelihood for severe anxiety in adulthood, right? And so all of these changes are inscribed into our genes, into the translation of these genes, the modification, you know,
And to
all of
the
this
and to the
epigenetic.
epigenetic modifications of that too.
Exactly. So it exists at a molecular level, it exists at a behavioral level.
Right.
And again, much of these influences, when we kind of map them out in terms of how, you know, these changes in gene transcription and translation occur at the level of the brain, again, they're all below the level of our conscious appreciation, right? So not only is
sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, all I was going to say there, just to finish, is just the sum of it is just, you know, not only can we not infer, you know, the average typical human processing that occurs similarly in all brains, but each of us have unique influences on the way that that processing occurs based on the environment that we're in, based on our genetic landscape, and then based on the way that we interpret our environment through feedback systems.
And all the other
So that's basically what I would say about that.
Sociocultural variables, historical variables, like just the sum of all the determinants. There are simply a large set of them. And if we knew enough about each one, theoretically, we could predict. But it goes through all of this deterministic soup of things that lead to outcomes. And it's not that there's this single individual actor, rather that actor, whatever that may be, is in fact the product of all these variables. And, you know, they lead to outcomes, right? Yeah, and I think just to add to that, so I would like to make the analogy between free will and spontaneous generation. How Louis Pasteur famously refuted the notion that complex organisms can just pop into existence ex nihilo, out of nothing. That's obviously false, right? Organisms are complex, and they can only emerge by descent with modification. They descend from ancestors, ancestors descend from ancestors, and so on. There can't be just something popping into existence. I would argue that that principle is a derivative of a more fundamental concept, which is that complex things, full stop, cannot just pop into existence. They must be descendant in some way from previous causes. Behavior and cognition are complex things. Therefore, behavior and cognition must descend from, or must emerge from, previous events. So there cannot be the spontaneous generation of cognition and behavior, much like there cannot be the spontaneous generation of organisms. So free will is a theory of, in this sense, it would be an incorrect theory of cognition and behavior because it postulates similar false assumptions as spontaneous generation of organisms does.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. I really like the way you framed that from the context of spontaneous generation. And I agree with you. And I think even in situations in which it appears as if complex things have emerged, there is an explanation. So, you know, human beings can seemingly, you know, with our wit and our intuition, synthesize vast amounts of information, and complex things can emerge almost instantaneously. And if you were to look at that out of context, it would seem like, okay, if we're to accept the argument that free will exists, then okay, perhaps that's just this inherent property of the system. But really, you know, if we appreciate the development of a human and we carefully observe babies, you know, going through that process of interacting with the world, we can see that information is slowly accrued, and over time, the brain develops pattern after pattern after information processing system, and it accumulates that ability to process such that, you know, by the time we're in adulthood, we can process things that as a 2-year-old would have taken, you know, an hour in the span of a millisecond. And of course, that's not scientifically accurate, but that's just a way to explain how this seemingly complex patterns can emerge from what appears to be spontaneous. So I agree with you completely. And I have to address this other point as well. One of the more famous contradictions here to this kind of framework that we've described about the emergence of consciousness and free will from the interconnection of neurons is this idea from Roger Penrose that, you know, consciousness and free will thereafter doesn't actually emerge from the connection of neurons, but it's an inherent property of individual cells. And I bring this up because one, I disagree with it completely, but two, it's kind of a similar idea, right? Yeah. Right. It's this concept of, it's almost a spontaneity. Right. It's scaffolded within, you know, the framework that it's a quantum interaction.
But it can't be
at the level of a single neuron. Right.
These events are not cellular, like consciousness is not a cellular property. It's a property of the whole system, right? And so is what some would say free will is. So it therefore cannot be that a cell is where the level of consciousness is or free will is. It just can't be that, right? So because that amounts to, you're attributing the wrong level of emergence to where we're trying to, the level of where we're trying to talk about it is, right?
Exactly. And all of the experimental evidence that we have goes against that assertion, right? You know, like if it isn't the case that if, again, as we already said earlier, but perhaps it's fine to repeat, you know, if we ablate certain regions of the brain, we make what are predictable and measurable alterations to our consciousness, right? You know, it isn't the case that we can just disrupt multiple parts of the brain, but we still have consciousness arising from those other neurons that weren't disrupted, and we feel the same way. That's not what happens, right? We can make predictable alterations to our consciousness based on disrupting connections, right? So I think all the evidence we have suggests that that framework is illogical, which of course is a large assertion going against Penrose with his, at best, unbelievable academic history. But, you know, we sometimes have to go with what the evidence suggests to us rather than what the you know, authority tells us.
Right, absolutely.
Jacob, you wanted to add something?
No, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you very elegantly kind of showed us and demonstrated what the neuroscience community is really like, where they stand on this. It's been really useful to get your input. I just want to ask, because there is something left on my mind, like one qualm that I have. Without free will, right? What's the point of it all? If you really believe that everything is predetermined, so what's the point, you know?
What do we gain from this also, to add to that?
Exactly.
It's a wonderful question. It's a very difficult question, so I'll do my best to answer it clearly and concisely. The way that I view it is that if it is the case that we don't have free will, it is also the case that we are aware of the fact that we don't have free will. And I think that's a very powerful conclusion to make, because if we look at all the agents in this planet that we inhabit and all the human beings that are the result of a wonderful level of complexity that like we can't even appreciate, and in a sense don't have all the tools at their disposal all the time to make the decisions that they'd like to, it allows for a level of compassion and understanding that I don't think could even exist if we had free will. That's a controversial statement, but it really opens us up to connection,
compassion,
and to belonging.
empathy. Yeah, right. So it allows us to, like if someone cuts you off when you're driving, instead of saying, oh, they're freely being mean to me, you could say, well, maybe they had a bad day, or, maybe they're rushing to the hospital, or maybe, all these other explanations. And it allows you to feel more compassion and therefore less angry and more in control. Paradoxically, the notion that we might not be responsible, or I should say, we might not be the authors of all of our behaviors can make us feel more free, paradoxically, because we realize what we really are. We're the product of evolution, of the universe, of many events that have led to this moment. And it allows us to feel a sense of solidarity and compassion with our other fellow human beings, as cliche as that might sound, who are also part of this universe and are part of the species of Homo sapiens. So, yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a nice way to kind of look at this whole scientific discussion and debate from, a perspective in which we can, act freely, and even if it is the case that this, what appears to at face value be a depressing conclusion, it's a nice metaphor for the way in which we can reinvent any problem to our own benefit and to improve interactions and communication and community between human beings.
Right. And it also means that we can build a better society. We can address the causes of events. And when we do that, when we address the cause and effect of things, we can make the outcomes better, right? Instead of, we can fix the structures that lead to oppression and bad outcomes. We can make society better by controlling, by altering the determinants of things to the extent that we can alter them. So, yeah.
And I think it's very humbling, right? I thought of this earlier in our conversation when we were introducing each other and just talking before the call, but I think it's humbling to think of, perhaps you've concluded that, the evidence suggests that determinism may be a better framework than free will, although that's still up for debate. But even if we do conclude that, the idea of having free, limited will is not so bad. It's humbling. We acknowledge that we're not in control. Exactly, that's what we're saying. We acknowledge that there's this deterministic framework that's likely at play. And that's the basis for this understanding, the lack of hubris, right? And that's the way we want to develop societies.
Right. Although these notions are still up for debate, but it is important for us to engage, and for the scientific community more generally to engage in these forms of scientific communication, to have a more scientifically literate and engaged public that can make these decisions, even though free will is challenging, despite the irony of that. But yeah, I think we've touched on a lot of great points, and with that, I think maybe we could wrap up. So thank you.
Thank Adam for your expertise. It's been a pleasure. This is a very interesting conversation, and definitely it doesn't end here. For our audience, we encourage you to continue to read. There are many, many great authors who have written extensively upon this subject. Yeah, keep exploring, keep thinking. And we'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me.